Welcome to another special episode of this Mexico City edition of our podcast. So you've got me today, and I'm going to be talking to two very special guests all about embryo creation here in Mexico City. Watching this, you'll be able to see this stunning background behind me. If I am in your ears, then I assure you I am doing this podcast today from Polanco in Mexico City. So I'm Michael, and I'm one of the founders here at My Surrogacy Journey, and I'm also a dad to two children born through surrogacy and egg donation. These podcasts, if you're new to this episode, they're all about busting some of those myths and giving you more information about some of the processes and some of the things that you need to know when on a surrogacy journey in Mexico City. So without any further ado, I want to get my guests introduced. You may be familiar with them from previous podcasts. To my left, I've got the lovely Dr Lucy Richardson from the Herts in Essex. Hello. Back in the UK. Hello.
Yeah.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. And I've got Dr. Gutierrez from Fertilidad Integral. How are you, sir?
Very well, Michael. Thank you for having me.
You are more than welcome. So let's get to some of the nitty-gritty as to what we're here to talk about today. As we know, some of our members that are embarking on a journey here in Mexico City, for some of our members, they're going to be creating embryos here versus what they would be doing in the UK. And I think it's going to be a really insightful episode to whether we encourage or we support our members or just give some extra clarity on what actually some of the processes are here, and does it differ to the UK, and let's sort of dive into some of that. So let's just talk about the process. Jose, let's start with you, please. So if someone is creating embryos here, and they might be a heterosexual couple using their own gametes, or they could be a same-sex couple that are maybe using a donor. Talk us through some of the processes at your clinic and how it works.
Okay, happy to, Michael. So we're actually talking, Lucy and me, off camera to understand like a little bit the process between the UK and Mexico. And the reality is that we're all doing what the UK started doing, no? So they started all in the UK. So what happens in the process tends to be very similar in clinics who are up to par with whatever regulatory basis, because we want to use the same media cultures. It's what we've been studying, it's what we've been seeing. So we have access to all the media companies and all the culture companies that have been sending it to Mexico. It's very similar to what happens in the UK. But well, basically, so we are a laboratory that has gone up to blastocyst stage, which should be the standard of treatment today. And what does this mean? That we want to grow embryos during 5 days and do the transfer of day 5 embryo, because that gives us the best per transfer success rate. It allows us to diminish the number of embryos, and we'll talk a little bit with Lucy about it, diminish the number of embryos transferred, and also have a good quality and understand what we have and be able to do PGT. So what happens in Mexico City, as to almost every other, I'm guessing, lab system in the UK, is we do the pickup. So the pickup comes after egg retrieval, and I know you've talked about the process in previous podcasts. And when we get the eggs, those are gone into culture media, and this culture media has to stay inside the eggs have to stay, whether they're donor or their own eggs, they have to stay in the media process during approximately 1 hour, 1.5 hours. They will vary a little bit between every clinic. Now there are different standard procedures, and after that, there will come the process of fertilization, which will be through IVF in our clinic or ICSI. How do we make the choice? Embryologists make the choice. Okay? They are the ones who are working with gametes every day of their life. So they're the ones who are saying if there's enough sperm concentration, we prefer at our clinic to do IVF because it's more of a semi-natural process. We have 50,000 to 100,000 sperms that will be in contact with the egg, and then we say the best ones, no, the best swimmer. Like we give a little bit of nature to select that process. Sperm, no? If the sperm sample is not good enough, then we'll do ICSI, okay? Or if it comes from a freezing process, there are several points where we need to do ICSI.
And for the listener, let's just break down ICSI again.
Yeah, of course.
So tell me a bit more. What is ICSI?
ICSI is intracytoplasmatic sperm injection. This is a technique developed in the early 90s, And what we do is with micromanipulator, we're able to select one sperm. This one sperm is injected into the oocyte, okay? And what that helps us is combat or to fight against male factor or severe male factor infertility. Because if they're not moving correctly, if there's not enough number of men, we're very inefficient in everything in our life. So we need millions to get one to do the right job, no? So here we give them a hand. We actually inject the sperm into the healthy egg. That allows us for a high fertilization process, okay? With men that have a severe sperm factor, that the sperm is not doing the necessary criteria. And there are other situations. If the eggs had been frozen, so for your patients, when they send eggs over to Mexico, we will have to do ICSI because that's more of a technical aspect, but we need to do ICSI on those patients, no?
Okay.
Well, let's say the standard. They fertilize. The next day, we see the embryos to see the eggs, to see which eggs became embryos, actually fertilized correctly. And then we put them in a culture system that is called a continuous culture system, which just means that we don't have to be taking them out because historically, we used to take them out every day, and as scientists, we want to see what's happening. Yeah, of course. Hey, 2 cells, and we're all celebrating. But
that's doing more harm, I would have thought, by disturbing them.
Today we know this. We didn't know
but
this
then you
before.
didn't know.
And we were learning. How do you know? And morphokinetics. Today there's time lapse that we will not discuss that today. But morphokinetics before was actually seeing them 10 minutes every day, but embryos turn out not to like light, not to like oxygen, not to like changing temperatures.
They're quite fussy little things, aren't they?
These guys. So we try to take them out as least as possible. And so they grow during 5 days, and on the 5th day, we'll take them out, see which embryos have become blastocysts, which is the stage on day 5, which Lucy's gonna explain to us because she's gonna do much nicer than I will ever be able to explain it. See which ones are healthy, and depending on the plan of we do individualized treatment. So we will have talked to the patients whether we want to do a fresh embryo transfer or a frozen embryo transfer. But this is the moment where we have to choose what happens to that embryo, whether we put it back into the uterus, or whether we freeze. And if we do freeze those embryos, whether we do a biopsy, which is the PGTA, so we take a small biopsy. We use laser, so there are different ways of taking biopsies. The most modern and most recommended way today that has shown evidence that damages the least the embryo is with a laser and with a flicking technique, which is this is technical things that also Lucy can explain to us.
Lucy loves that part of her job. I know what she's like with biopsy.
Because this is done by the embryologist, so I love to work with her. I love seeing them. They're handling the start of life, so it's beautiful to see embryologists. But I always say embryologists do embryology, clinicians, we do the clinical part. But they do get involved, and I love to see how the laboratory is working. We freeze with vitrification systems, so culture systems specifically that have been approved by the European Union and by FDA approved, because that lets me know that they're compliant as international. These are imported into Mexico, so I just want, because I don't have access to this, let's say, factories, that way is the way that I know they're compliant with anything that we should be doing. We don't use home-based medium, which used to be something they used to do, that you create yourself, because it's a regulatory product. It's a whole different animal to do this kind of medium. They're very super specific. And all this time at Fertilidad Integral, I always say it's not for the patient, it's for me to sleep soundly at night. We try to use as many, let's say, tools that we can to keep the embryo safe and the IP safe. So what we're doing is we're using a RA witness system, which is an electronic witness system that helps us diminish as much as possible human error. So we do have to embryologist at all time with the embryos to avoid the mistakes, etc. But during this whole process at our clinic, and there are different kind of the systems, we have a radio frequency chip that lets us know who the eggs are, who the sperm is, when they create the embryos, which embryos are, so that we diminish as most as possible a confusion.
Completely tracked all the way
through the process to vitrification, and then when we unfreeze, the tracking is turned on again. So that way we know that when we unfreeze, we make sure that Michael, so use as an example, embryos are unfrozen when Michael's case is turned back on, and whatever is going to happen in the next steps, or when we get the PGTA results, we are making sure that the PGTA result is stored in the correct place, and this helps us diminish this process. And a lot of these processes come from programs that have had a bigger history in this kind. No? So the UK.
That was my next question, because you don't have a fertility regulator as such, do you? So it's, where do you pull all of this information from as a country? How do you look to other standards, or how's all this built and perfected?
So we do have a regulatory process, which is the same as the FDA will be in the States. Sorry, I use the States. It's closer to us, and it's what I believe, but it will be like HIFA, no? So HIFA regulates specifically, that's our healthcare system, which regulates. But since there's no specific guidelines to IVF process, we're under healthcare regulation. So we are regulated. It's not that we're not regulated, it's just our regulation is very ambiguous in the sense that it's not specifically for IVF.
Yeah.
What do? We try to look for international organizations that help us give best practice guidelines. Yeah. So that's the way that we know we're regulated, because I love, for example, me personally, the best practice guideline from ESHRE is a very complete, thorough, and very clear guideline to work under. And my understanding is, if you're following this guideline, you will be regulated in practically any country in Europe. You know, like it's a little bit like this is the minimum, and then they have the minimum they require, competitive value, and then their benchmark. So we're always shooting to be there, a benchmark. We try to regulate our genetics process, how we do our tubing, all this. Lucy will explain it to you guys, don't worry. But this technical aspect of IVF is extremely beautiful, but extremely specialized. So our embryologists have to be very clear on their standard operating procedures, how their manuals are working, where they're getting their lots. I mean, there are a lot of things going on in the laboratory, how they make sure that the culture system is maintained the correct way, that they're in the correct temperature, that there are the situations where there will be recall of certain culture systems, and we have to know what number we're using, what series number we're using, so that we're able to get it back. So this process are actually copied or mounted by what's happened in the UK. And why the UK? Because you guys were first. So you guys did it first. So we're just going behind like a little bit, this works, it doesn't work, and putting it down for a clinic in Mexico City. No, there will be difference just because we're in a different location.
Of course.
We have to order with a lot more time culture system because they have to be brought in internationally. This whole situation, we do make it so it's safe for the clinic in Mexico. No?
And I think that's what's going to give people so much comfort that are watching or listening, because again, some of these really common misconceptions when people are talking about having fertility treatment abroad, whatever country it might be, they always have an opinion that that's of a lesser standard of where treatment might be where they're from. And clearly this is not the case with Mexico. And what I'm really hearing here, and Lucy, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no real difference in terms of what this process is, and the skill, the medium, the quality of what's happening here is like the UK, especially if you're pulling from the likes of ESHRE as well in terms of best practice and just cultural techniques.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As Jose mentioned before we started recording, I just wanted to, touch. Do you do that? Oh yeah, no, we do this. Oh, do you do that? Yeah, we do the same. Oh yeah, okay, we do the same. Yeah, okay, we do the same. So I mean, that's fantastically reassuring.
Yeah.
If we're going to take anyone, and I will take the UK as a gold standard, to know that those techniques and to know that those procedures that are followed, things such as like the traceability, knowing exactly where your gametes have been throughout the whole time. You guys use RI witnessing. At Herts and Essex, we developed RI witnessing. So, it's fantastic to see that, we're still following and adhering and working to those standards, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what country you're in, the embryo has incredible needs. Absolutely phenomenal needs, and as an embryologist we need to make sure that we are providing them with everything that they need to go on and thrive and develop. So for example, minimizing the number of times that we're taking them out of the incubator to make sure that they're in the safest and the best environment to help them nurture them and grow them. Mm-hmm. That doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in the UK, whether you're in Mexico City, those needs of those embryos still need to be met, and met to a really, really high standard, which is what both our clinics do.
Yeah, that's super clear. And when we're looking at then the sperm and egg health, then if you're managing your patients, doctor, when you're looking at general sperm health or egg health, how would our members be interacting with you when they arrive at the clinic, when they're wanting to understand any more they need to do with regards to egg health or sperm health? Because I know that we'll be our sort of Debbie Evans will all be talking to them when they're in the UK, just ensuring everyone's fully aware of what that treatment and protocol is going to be when they get to Mexico City. What do your team do anything in addition to that in sort of supporting members with understanding optimum sperm and egg health?
I mean, I think this is part of why with Debbie Evans, we've had this great conversation as to how do we select patients. Health on eggs and sperm will have to be developed 90 days before. Sperm, especially 72 days, and then there will be a lot of talk on what supplements or lifestyle modifications you can do, and should you wait a little bit on that. But definitely, unfortunately, there is very little we can do as to what they can do once they get to Mexico, no? But what we can is have a clear communication with our patients. So we do individualize patients. So we will have an online call set up with our treating doctor. In this case, let's say me. We'll discuss the patient's needs, PCOS. So they actually, it's great because they get 4 or 6 sites on this kind of cases because they get their doctor in UK to talk to them, then they get the doctor in Mexico, then we'll see expectations. Debbie will be also talking to them as to how they can change their lifestyles, etc., to try to get as healthy as possible, to increase security and to get to increase security and to improve results as much as possible. But the day of the pickup, and when we're in stimulation, that process will be very hard to change on the quality of gametes. It's too late to say that coming into Mexico will be anything different. What do? We are very strict in our protocol, stimulation protocol for triggering. So when we do trigger, we're very animate about making sure that the follicles that we're seeing have to do with the level of estradiol. We like dual trigger, which tends to give embryologists a little bit healthier eggs and an easier way of fertilization. We individualize each patient, so we will look at the sperm sample to see whether they will need classic IVF, so it's just dropping 50,000 sperms into a drop with the egg, or if they would do ICSI, that we already discussed it. And this is important for us to individualize treatment. As to, we try to follow protocols that will give us the most mature eggs, etc., and that's what we're looking for during our KPI. So that's how we're measuring our KPI. So we do have, what do we have here in Mexico City Clinic? We have around an 85% maturity rate, which is the eggs. What are we giving to the embryologist to work with, which is a good percentage of all the eggs that we're giving them. We're giving 85. Embryologists are having around, with ICSI, which is the easiest way to say, that's why we're having around a 95% fertilization rate, which means that they did create an embryo. And then the blastulation rate into day 5. This is women under 40, because we want to compare apples with apples.
Yeah,
no?
of course.
So that's the way that we see that we're doing similar success rates as to what's happening over in Europe with good clinics, and there will be certain variations. But how do we keep those eggs safe? Using the correct materials for the correct part of the job. So we use, again, culture systems that have been compliant. We're measuring the lotting systems. We're checking our KPIs to get the best possible. I wish there could be something more we could do on the day of arrival, but that's the previous thing that we're trying to do with the doctors in the UK and with Debbie, but that's the way this.
And I know the two of you were talking before we started this. Is there anything that differs there from I know there's an additional test that you might do that we probably don't do in the UK. One of the pre-trigger test. Were you talking about that earlier?
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about that, because that was interesting.
Yeah, so after the lady's had her period of stimulation, obviously she's been monitoring by scans. We're looking to see how many follicles are developing on the ovary. And when they get to a certain point where they have a certain number of a certain size, then they'll have their trigger injection. Now you will always double check that the trigger has been administered properly by taking another blood test.
Correctly. So our standard operating procedure here in the clinic is 12 hours after they do their trigger shot, we measure LH levels. And what we're looking, will depend a bit on most patients, we're looking for that trigger shot to elevate our LH levels. If they don't hit a minimum of 50 international units, then something went wrong with the trigger shot, and we have to investigate. Either maybe the patient didn't understand the dosing correctly, or she forgot to do the trigger shot, or she dropped half the vial, and at least for us, it makes it a little bit more work for our nurses because they have to take one more blood work, and I know it's uncomfortable for patients. And 99% of the time, we get that normal LH search, which we're looking for maturity, because that lets us give us embryologist a mature egg. But there are a couple of cases a year where we don't get that LH, and that allows us to rescue the treatment.
The cycle. You by that one test, you can, like you said, completely safeguard and help making sure that a cycle's saved, essentially, by knowing at that stage.
Exactly. So if we have a drop, we didn't hit that level, we'll call the patient immediately and say, hey, how did you trigger? What happened? Was there something off? Was something wrong? Whatever. And then we can also rescue. We can re-trigger the patient, change the day or the time of pickup, and get the healthier eggs. Because if we don't trigger, then we're going to get a lot of immature eggs, and they won't fertilize correctly, they won't develop, and then all these KPIs that we talked about will be on the floor because we didn't. And this is for all patients. I mean, whether they're here in Mexico, but imagine if we add on the cost that they traveled here, it's a failed cycle because the trigger shot wasn't correctly. That's why we do that extra. But we do it on all our patients because cost benefit. It's a safety, extra safety that a lot of people wouldn't use them.
Yeah,
I know why they didn't use it. It's not incorrect not to use it. It's just, again, our first mission is safety, but second, really close, is quality of treatment. And this gives us to help patients understand if something or to help us understand what's happening with the patient.
What's going on. What's in terms of the treatment when people have treatment here, freezing of eggs or then fertilization, then freezing of the embryo. Is there a particular pattern that you like to work with, or what do you do mostly when creating embryos? Do you tend to freeze eggs that have been retrieved, or is this all down to, again, the parameters that you're seeing from the quality of the sperm? Do you tend to freeze at any point there, or
only because of logistics, Michael? And I'll leave this to Lucy. Every time we do something to an egg or a sperm or an embryo, there's a chance of losing it. Cells are not meant to be frozen. So the only reason I would freeze eggs to then unfreeze them and fertilize them is the sperm sample is not here or there is a special situation. But in general, no, we want to do everything in fresh all the way to day 5 and at that moment freeze. So we avoid, and I think you can explain it a little bit more than me, Lucy.
Yeah, I mean, every time, freezing is fantastic. It's an incredible tool, and the technology has evolved. The success rates are absolutely fantastic, but again, they're not without some risk. So if we have the intention of creating embryos for either transfer or genetic testing or subsequent freezing, there's no benefit to freezing at an earlier stage if there's no clinical indication to do so. So yes, we've got eggs, we've got sperm, let's create the embryos, let's grow them to the blastocyst stage, so that's day 5 in their development. We know that there's an important shift in a way that an embryo develops between day 3 of development and day 5 of development. So at the earlier stages of development, an embryo is sort of powered and controlled by the eggs and the sperm, but when it goes past day 3 of development, it needs to regulate its own cell division, so it needs to become competent.
You know me, I love all of this stuff.
Become competent at controlling its own development. If an embryo is not able to do that, then it's not going to go on and give rise to a pregnancy. So by leaving them to the blastocyst stage, we're expecting to see some fall off. If I've got 10 eggs, I'm not expecting all of them to go to the blastocyst stage, but that's not a bad thing. That's that natural selection process. That's the embryo saying, okay, we actually haven't got the ability to continue any further, but these guys do. And though it's part of that natural selection happening on in the lab, which is really, really important. As much as we've got the science, there's nature. And we have to learn and be guided by what our embryos or what our eggs are saying to us, what our sperm is saying to us. We have to learn from them, and we're just facilitating the most appropriate form of treatment based on what they're telling us.
Based on what's happening, yeah. And then carrier screening then, Doctor, in here, again, that all takes place within the clinic using the partners that you work with, just like we would in the UK? All of your carrier type screening that you might be doing?
So carrier genetic testing is a testing that we do 2 IPs that we're looking for autosomic recessive disorder. So this goes into the genetic field. So what the genetics let us know is certain patients, 1% of patients, will find their match or the person they're looking for, or a donor in certain cases, where they're carriers for the same disease. And nature that we're talking right now is very intelligent, and they gave us 2 alleles, so two genetics for each one of these genes, so that if we inherit it from one of our parents, genetic parents, then the other one comes in and rescues, and we do not have the disease. But if we inherit both of them in this kind of diseases, then we'll have the disease. And this is a rare diseases, very rare, but very severe diseases that have been detected. Carrier testing is checking today for 527 genes, and there might be an odd number because they've been adding slowly new genes. And what we're looking is to see which genetic parents or sperm are not compatible, in the meaning that they could have this kind of rare diseases. So
the co-carriage that we often hear about.
Yeah, exactly. So if both the sperm and the egg have that potential, could have that gene, then they could have the disease. And then there's this whole inheritance pattern that a geneticist has to evaluate this patient. But what we're doing is identifying those IPs, okay? So that we might, when we do create the embryo and we do genetic testing later on, they will be able to test for that specific disease. Very common, well, not very common, one of the most known, it will be cystic fibrosis in Europe. And what we want to avoid is these children having cystic fibrosis, because they will have a lot of problems with their health and their development if we do not, if they are born with this genetic disorder. So this is like the one most known around Europe, or one of the most known diseases that have to do with this carrier testing gene, no? So I think HIFA, well, I'm not sure, but I know in the UK you have to test for 4 diseases, no, Lucy? I think cystic fibrosis, karyotype,
and then the standard.
Fragile X, okay.
No, we don't need to. No,
Okay.
it's just the CF and the karyotype.
And the karyotype. So in Mexico, it doesn't have to be done, but when we do it, we tend to do this bigger panel.
Bigger panel.
Yeah, there's a big Jewish descendant community here in Mexico, and we have the access to it. No, that not everywhere in the world has the access to this kind of test. They're sent to the US, they test for this 500 genes, and then we get the results back. But the beauty of this is not that doesn't mean that you cannot have children with that person. What it means is that we know that those patients specifically, when we do create the embryos, we will freeze all the embryos. So here it goes a little bit about individualizing the treatment. Do the genetic analysis, but this one is PGTM. Why PGTM? Because we're doing pre-genetic testing for pre-implantation genetic testing, for monogenetic diseases. And this allows us to identify out of all the embryos which ones would have the disease, which we will recommend not to transfer, of course, then which ones will be carriers, which will be like the parents, like the genetic parents, no, but they will not have the disease but have the ability to give it to their children, and then which ones are healthy on that disease, no? Wow. So they do not have. So it's very beautiful because we're avoiding certain things to have healthy families, because yes, we want babies, and yes, we want families, but we want healthy ones. No? We want to try to create an environment where we're promoting the best scenario for the family. And we have a lot of patients coming in that don't have reproductive problems. They have a risk of
some of these conditions, potentially. How long has this type of testing been practiced? Are we seeing more and more types of tests like this, Lucy, within your field?
Yeah, so
what's common?
As I mentioned before, so in terms of our regulatory requirements, we're not required to test for genetic conditions further than being a carrier of cystic fibrosis or checking for the karyotype. However, we have seen certainly a shift in culture, a shift in awareness, and we have the ability to do extended carrier screen testing. And certainly a lot of the, for example, American sperm banks, if we're bringing in sperm donors, they will have had this extended carrier screening. And that prompted us at Herts and Essex to say, well, look, we have the ability to potentially avoid something and pick something up.
And increase that panel.
And we wouldn't else have known. So for us now, our egg donors are all subject to extended carrier screening. Amazing. And so are our sperm donors.
Brilliant.
If somebody returns, as you mentioned, returns positive for a particular condition, we then have the option of matching the recipient or testing the recipient to make sure that we are excluding that condition as far as possible. And to put it into perspective, I mean,
because we are all
everybody
carriers.
is carriers, yeah. So, you know, I wasn't tested before I had children with my husband, you know, so but we've got
the technology now.
We've gone to that extra level and that extra step, so we can, you know, have these tests available to us. So, you know, certainly it's definitely worth doing if there is a potential to then avoid another invasive technique, which is such as performing PGTM.
Yeah. Love it, absolutely love it. And then we're going to talk in a second about the day 1 to day 5, because this keeps coming up, so I want to just break that down in a minute, Lucy. But let's just talk for those people that are interested about fresh sperm and frozen sperm, because we've spoken about previously in the UK on podcasts about, you know, the hardiness of an egg versus a sperm. Lucy, talk to us a bit about fresh versus frozen sperm, and yeah, let's just dive into that a bit.
Can I have my official title?
You can have. So I don't know whether you know, Doctor, but Lucy's official title is, you tell him.
I'm the sperm queen.
You're the sperm queen. That's your okay. Why are you the sperm queen?
Because I love it. Sperm is absolutely fascinating. It really, really does. When you think about who we are, sperm is 50% of the building block of where we came from. And I think quite often the sperm provider can be overlooked somewhat in treatment. You know, we can be guilty of saying, okay, let's do this very, very detailed medical history of the woman. Has he got sperm? Yes, no. You know, and that's sometimes
it's true.
It is true.
Oh, no more testing. It's enough.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. We can use that.
Yeah.
But you know, for some chaps, they will have very poor sperm parameters, and we may recommend freezing as a backup, potentially in case there is evidence of you know, decreasing parameters.
Yeah.
If there's any concerns at all with production, then we can alleviate that further stress by freezing a sample. But when we do freeze a sample, we know that it is stressful on that sample. So we will see that there is a drop down in the number of sperm that are swimming, potentially drop down in the number of sperm. The sperm might respond differently, so they may be more fragile after the freezing and the thawing process. So, but you will have a little bit of a degree of drop down. But that's why we've got, you know, processes and procedures in the lab that we can compensate for. So if we were to see that we had a frozen sample where the parameters weren't quite so good as before they were frozen, then we can use something like ICSI. So that's where we're injecting sperm directly into the eggs, just to give that sperm a little bit of a helping hand. Yeah.
So I've got to ask you, and you're gonna have tons of these for me anyway. But give me and the viewer and the listener a couple of sperm facts that we might not know.
I think what's really important, actually, if the listeners were listening closely, I think they'll have picked up on something that Jose said previously. So what you produce now, if I was to say, Mike, can I have an ejaculate now, please?
Wow, okay. I wasn't expecting doing that on today's podcast.
What you produce for me now formed in your body 3 months ago. So if you were on a stag do, if it was Christmas, if you had the flu, if you had COVID, 3 months down the line, that will then potentially impact on your sperm sample. So if you are looking at starting a fertility journey or a treatment cycle, look at your lifestyle, because for men particularly, you have an ability to potentially increase what we're working with.
There's an opportunity to improve it
at home. And lifestyle does have an incredible impact on sperm quality, and we know what's not good for us. We know drinking to excess is no good for us. We know smoking is no good for us. We know drugs are no good for us. We know this. But in terms of your reproductive health and, you know, the potential ability to conceive and the building blocks for what your child will be, you have the potential to make a difference, and that's
unlike women in some senses.
So, you know, someone who's an egg provider are born with the number of eggs that they're ever going to have, and every time they have a menstrual cycle, we lose more of our stock of eggs. We see that by looking at our AMH levels, or that tells us basically the number of eggs we've got left. That's going to deplete over time, and there's nothing we can do to stop that. But for sperm providers, you know, if there is a lifestyle influence, I mean, and it's not even necessarily, you know, the naughty and inverted commas things. You know, if you're driving your car, have you got your heated seats on?
Yeah.
Because if you are,
Yeah.
you're exposing your testicles to high temperatures. Now, the testicles are outside the body because sperm production happens at lower than core body temperatures, so that's why they're there. So if you're then exposing them to heat, you know, you go to the gym in the morning and you stick your heated seats on, you might be going out and working out, but then you're potentially impacting
Sit
your
in the
sperm.
sauna, all of that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. Sit and do sit at home with your laptop on your lap. You know, what sort of underwear do you wear? Are you supportive? Is it too tight? All of these things can go on and have a massive difference.
Wow. You really are sperm queen, aren't you? You really, really are. Right, so let's talk about... So she needs a badge.
Yeah, of course.
Not quite sure how that would work. But anyway, let's talk then the all-important day 1 to day 5. Lucy, talk us through, and Doctor, feel free to interject. What is day 1? What is day 5? Let's just go through that life cycle, those crucial 5 days.
So to put those days into perspective, we take day 0 as the day of our egg collection.
Okay.
So you'll have your stimulation, you take your trigger, about 36 hours later, then you'll come in and you have your egg collection procedure. So the doctor, under ultrasound guidance, will use a small needle to drain the fluid from your follicles. The fluid is then passed through to the embryologist, and we search through that fluid and we isolate the eggs. Say that happens in the morning. About 4 hours later, we're then looking at introducing sperm and egg, whether that's through conventional IVF or whether it's through ICSI.
Why the delay? What was the 4-hour delay?
So there is a little period of time in the lab where we will put the embryo or the eggs back into the incubator.
Okay.
We know that we need to get them, they need to be mature in order to fertilise. So during the processing of the eggs, it does take a little bit of time before we're ready to introduce the sperm. But once we've done so, they then go back in the incubator. They sit nice and warm and undisturbed, and we hope overnight that the eggs and the sperm will interact in the correct way to achieve fertilisation. The following day, we're checking them first thing in the morning in the lab for signs of fertilisation. Well, by that I mean we know that the sperm and the egg have interacted in the correct way to form an embryo. Not every egg will be able to fertilise. We might find that we're checking them and we have some which have sadly failed to survive overnight. That's unfortunately a risk of what we do. We may see some that simply don't fertilise, but we may also see abnormal fertilisation. So although the sperm and the egg have met, they haven't interacted in the correct way to go on and give rise to an embryo that will give rise to a viable pregnancy. So we check them carefully, select out those normally fertilised eggs, and then they go back in the incubator. And then this is where the scary part comes for the patient.
I remember this part.
Because for 5 days, we leave them there undisturbed. Okay, so historically, yes, we used to check them. So we do something called an early cleavage check. So we do our fertilisation check in the morning. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we do an early cleavage check. So we're looking to see, have we had any cell division? We then take them out, have a look down the microscope, put them back. The next day, we'd historically, on day 2, we'd check again. So taking them out, disturbing their environment, potentially increasing the element of risk, because every time as an embryologist we're handling a dish of embryos, there is risk there.
Totally.
We'd then put them back again. The next day, let's have another look. So yes, it satisfied our curiosity, and yes, we could give information to the patients, but if we're considering we're transferring a blastocyst, all of that cumulative information, when we then look at our embryos on day 5, that's potentially the most important thing. And also with the ability to genetically test those embryos, does it necessarily matter whether it was an early cleaver or whether it was at what stage it got to what? That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah. Okay, that's just a whole researching episode.
That's a whole new episode. But for the purposes of what we're doing now, we know that if we culture and grow our embryos in a safe and stable environment, we're encouraging them to form blastocysts. We know that we can see which ones have stopped developing along the way. I could look on day 3 and I could ring a patient and say, amazing, all 10 of your embryos are at the 8-cell stage.
Which would be day 3.
At day 3.
Yeah.
But then I ring them on day 5 and I say, oh, amazing, 3 of them have formed blastocysts. And they go, well, hang on a second.
What happened to the rest?
Wrong?
You gave me this big boost of everything's working nicely.
But ultimately, if we're looking for the formation of blastocysts, then leaving them to that point undisturbed is the best way that you can grow them.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there any stats or research that, if people are wondering, okay, so I've got 15 eggs retrieved, and what that process looks like, is there ratios of how numbers drop off or where you get to?
Yeah, every patient is different.
Uh-huh.
Every set of sperm and eggs is different, so every cycle is different, but sort of as a general rule of thumb, I'm going to work with 10.
Yeah, it's a nice, easy number.
Much easier. So we've got 10 eggs collected. I'm hoping that we've probably got about 80% mature. So say we've got 8 mature. We're then mixing the sperm and the eggs together. We're hoping 6 or 7 of them will fertilise. We're then going to grow them to the blastocyst stage. We're hoping that we're going to get, say, 60% of them to get to the blastocyst stage. So I've now got 4 embryos. Not every embryo is going to be of an equal quality. Say 50% of them will be utilisable, so can be transferred or can be frozen. So you can see we've gone from a massive drop down of it. And also when you've had your scans, the number of follicles that you have, quite often you'll have fewer eggs, because some of those follicles will be smaller follicles that either won't contain eggs or won't contain eggs that are usable in the lab. So you're always going to get a drop down in numbers. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, it's perfectly
that natural
normal.
selection process, and it's completely normal. But we have to make sure that our patients are informed
Yeah.
and know what to expect before we start treatment for them.
Amazing. And doctor, from a comparison then, in compared to what Lucy's just been saying, how does that work for you? Is it similar?
I think we're aligned. We're both surprised. Like when Lucy asked me before the podcast, like, when do you see embryos? And like day 1 and day 5, she was like, why? And I'm like, why see them more? No, like, what's the benefit? There is no benefit. There's a curiosity, and we want to know. We should make this huge checklist as to understanding. But on the clinical perspective, we always have to say, what do we want? Safety, okay,
Yeah.
that's clear. And second one, best possible results. And there's no benefit on taking out the embryos, but definitely a problem. So we know that when we were taking out embryos, we were losing embryos just because they got light, they got cold, they were more fragmented. I mean, we were hurting embryos. Changing temperatures can increase rates of genetic alterations, chromosomal alterations.
Okay.
Temperature difference can increase the rate of aneuploidies and chromosomal alterations in embryos. So why should we be doing this that we're not going to get any benefit except
Our own curiosity.
curiosity? And humans are not patient. We have everything right now. Uber, all these things is immediate, no?
Yeah.
We need an immediate knowing of what's going on the result. And nature is very smart. If we're patient, we let them in the right temperature. If everything is well, there is nothing we can do. Nature will take its course. If the egg is not going to create a baby, it's not going to create a baby whether I see it or I don't see it. However, if I wait till blastocyst, I might have at least a diminished chance of hurting it just because we wanted to look at it. It's not being a bad person. It's just there's no benefit on looking. So we're using the same protocol. This is why the cultures that were developed by a lot of companies have been made now to do continuous, because we used to be also, that was a reason to see it, no, right, Lucy? We had to change mediums before.
Yeah.
No, we had to take them out to change them from one drop to another one.
Okay.
Today we don't have to. Technology has gone to allowing us to this kind of technology. It's incubator. We bring our incubators from the RESCO incubators, they're called. These are benchtop incubators. They also use them a lot in Europe. And I'm not sure what does Essex have or incubators.
Benchtop minks.
Minks, okay.
Yeah.
And what it allows us today is just to not even each embryo, each patient is in their own chamber. So even if embryo number Wes's embryos are on day 3 and then Michael's embryos are on day 5, we can open individually each one of the cases, and we don't have to open the whole incubator where everybody.
All of them.
Exactly. And it's all made so that we do not disturb embryos.
So we've just been talking about various techniques, and on a previous episode, we've also spoken about the freezing and the thawing and how that's changed over the years.
Yeah.
Again, just recap and talk to us a bit more about freezing and thawing and why the different techniques matter now.
Yeah, so we have evolved enormously in our techniques and our ability to freeze and thaw embryos. So back in the day when I first started, we had something called slow freezing, which comparative to what we have now, the success rates were much poorer. So with the slow freezing, you were freezing 4 embryos, hopefully 50% of them would survive by the very virtue and the nature of what that process was. Now we have vitrification. If I see an embryo that doesn't survive the freezing and the thawing via vitrification, it's quite a shock.
Okay.
So we would be looking at upwards of 95% survival using these newer techniques. So combining them with techniques and technologies such as PGT, it gives us so much more ability to offer more complex and offer things such as social freezing. We're aware of elective egg freezing to preserve fertility, but equally you can preserve your fertility as a couple by embryo freezing. But the evolution of these technologies is just given such good success rates. And there was a big study in the UK that was looking at actually should we move to just doing everything as a freeze-all cycle. So when you're stimulating, you're increasing your levels of certain hormones to a certain point that potentially could hinder implantation. So the theory was actually, do we get rid of all of the potential side effects of that stimulation?
Let the body then recover.
Exactly, and then just freeze it and then replace on a frozen embryo replacement cycle. Now, the study that came out didn't go particularly either way, but certainly it showed that by freezing, you had just as good chance of success if you wanted to than if you'd have had a fresh embryo transfer cycle. So that's, for lots of different reasons, patients are either electing to freeze or in a circumstance where replacing an embryo is not appropriate. So if they were at risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, we know that we can protect that patient by freezing those embryos and then transferring on a subsequent cycle. So as you say, safety first and always.
But it used to be, the line of safety used to be very thin before, because when you're losing half of the embryos just because of the process, then clinicians as well as embryologists were more tempted to doing, okay, this woman is at a high risk for hyperstimulation syndrome, but kind of not such a high risk, so we kind of transfer them, which getting pregnant is the worst thing you can do to a hyperstimulated patient, but then you're afraid that she wasn't going to get pregnant, no? Or transferring 4 embryos, 3, 4 embryos. I mean, it was the 90s, it was a whole different era but of course we had different cases that we don't see today, thanks to the techniques of vitrification process. So yeah, I mean, today, like Lucy says, it's when we don't have when we unfreeze an embryo, we unfreeze 1 embryo at a time because we know we're gonna get it.
Yeah.
We don't have to unfreeze an extra one in case it doesn't unfreeze, which we used to like, well, let's unfreeze 4 because maybe we'll get 1 or 2, and that doesn't happen today.
Anymore. No.
It shouldn't happen today.
No.
And not all clinics, and we have to be honest, around the world, not all clinics have the technology and the skill set and the training for vitrification, because it's a skill set. When you see embryologists work, you're like, they actually work with their hands. They still have skills. It's not like Excel, you really need there's a training process, because I'm sure juniors, they don't get it the first time. So they do go through a process. They use embryos that we know are not going to give us babies, so that they learn with. But once they have their training set in, it's amazing to see that you can freeze an embryo, leave it there 30 years, unfreeze it, and
it is mind-blowing, isn't it? It really is. We touched on clinic success rates. Let's talk a bit about what are those success rates and how do they compare? Let's chat through that. Doctor, what's it like in your clinic setting, and what types of success rates are monitored and what's published?
So I love this subject. I really like it, because here we have to talk apple with apples, oranges with oranges.
Yes.
And statistics, it's such a hassle, especially in reproductive, because your pregnancy rate per transfer rate per clinical pregnancy rate, biochemical pregnancy rate.
All of your parameters being the same.
What are we talking about? So when we're talking about KPIs, again, ESHRE, because they defined it very clearly, like what are we talking about? And we want to talk about laboratory, not about programs, because programs, you start working on cumulative life rates, costs, per transfer, live birth rates, or at least clinical pregnancies, because that keeps you individualizing patients. But when you're talking about laboratories, you have to be very specific on what you're looking for. First, you want to go into what's going into the laboratory. And here, we could have a whole discussion on KPIs on laboratory. But what we're looking is what are the doctors giving to the lab, okay? So this is, out of all the eggs that we gave, how many of them are mature? And ESHRE guidelines will tell you that you want 80, 85%, all the way up to 90. Here there could be a discussion because it also depends on the doctor who's doing the pickup. Because if you're like me and you're like, I don't care if it's a very small follicle, I'm gonna puncture it anyway because we have a chance and numbers matter in this game because of how Lucy told you. Hey, if I only pick the big ones, yeah, my percentage of eggs. So this is kind of like very criticized KPI, but you want to have around 80% because then you're giving good material to the embryologist, no? And then everything else has to be selected on which kind of patients you're talking about. So normally KPI will be women under 40, where the male factor, the sperm, is normal, okay, because we want to take that, let's say, factor, or no, we don't want it be affecting. Also age, we want to avoid it being affected. And we will see what are we looking in the lab. First of all, is fertilization rates. How well are they fertilizing? So when we're talking, and Lucy will get that wrong, will tell me, but we want to be with ICSI, because this is the injection of the sperm. How many of all the eggs, mature eggs, that we injected, how many fertilized? In our lab, it's 95%. We want to be always, our KPI is being above 90%. That gives us a good. And then with in vitro fertilization, so a normal, let's say a classic IVF cycle, when we drop the sperm, we don't know which ones are mature and which ones are not. So our fertilization will drop because those 2 eggs in the 10 egg game that Lucy was talking about, the mature eggs, we cannot say they weren't mature or were not mature, fertilized, abnormal. So we have to include them in the system, and we want it to be above an 85%, okay? And that's where we're at 84.5 or something on fertilization rate on IVF, which are great labs. When you see ESHRE guidelines, you have your competency values, which is the minimum you need to say that you're an IVF program, and the benchmark. And then the most important part is not most important, the next important part is how many of those embryos, because now they're called embryos because they fertilized, or if you're very embryologist, a zygote, and because they're very particular about the moment everything happens. And then to day 5, to the blastulation. This is blastulation, okay? And why is this important? Because at the end of the day, IVF, and Lucy's gonna kill me today, but it's not this big science thing. We're not being very efficient. What we're doing is we're concentrating 2 years of ovulation of a woman, or 1 year, whatever we can get, into one shot. So I always tell my patients, this is like trying to hit a target, okay? If I only have 1 shot and I'm standing 10 feet away, I might hit it or I might not. But if I have 10 shots, at least 1 I'm gonna hit it. And age becomes distance, no? The further back we are, the harder it will be to hit that same target. Yeah. So we want the higher numbers we have of blastocysts, the higher numbers of finding that one embryo that will become a baby. Because even when we have good blastocyst development, PGTA normal embryo, everything is perfect, and we're like, this is a beautiful embryo. And Dr. Lucy, the sperm queen, said, this is perfect morphology. And we got the genetic test from the geneticist, and we're like, everything is fine. 35% of those patients will not get pregnant. Why? Nature. There's a lot more. We're in the ABC, and we're not even reading books yet, and we need to understand philosophy. So we're still very early in the development, so we need numbers to get this. So the better lab system we have, those 1, 2, 3 embryos, will give our patients better prognosis. That's why we invest this money in this kind of lab system. That's why numbers really do matter in this game of IVF. This is why the KPIs. And what can you do is we compare ourselves, or we try to find research on what's happening in other clinics. So we do look at the data in the UK. We do look at the data that ESHRE published from 2019 on what's happening with other clinics. We do see SART, which, I mean, the best thing about the US is that they keep stats, and they keep stats up to date. So we're saying, hey, if I ever find a clinic that gets a 99% blastulation rate, first of all, nobody here will believe them, or they'll be studying with them, because we want that. But the reality in human reproduction is that there are a lot of things in nature that go wrong. Unfortunately, the embryo itself says, I'm not going to grow. It's easy. We're not doing PGTA to thousands of embryos that we'll need to, or transferring thousands, because the embryo itself told us on day 3, my genetics is wrong. That's why they stop growing.
Yeah.
No? Or stop developing, sorry. And that's a beautiful part that we have to listen to the embryo quality. But also the other side, if something happens any month and our rates drop down, is what happened. Hey, the culture system, we had a new cultures coming in. It might have been that the problem. Or maybe our filtration air system is not doing well. Let's see what's happening. Or maybe it was just one case that was a PCOS patient. Okay, so it's a clinical point. It's not the laboratory, but our embryologists are always looking at the data, because if something falls out of place, they will stop. They will signal out a warning to the team and say, hey, we have to review this case, clinical embryology, because only 50% fertilized, or could be the sperm, so let's call Lucy and see what we can do better, or maybe, hey, let's check that incubator and see if anybody else's embryo were growing there, because let's make sure maybe the incubator, there will be human errors, there will be a situation going. The point is detecting them quick and being able to pivot to get a good result for our patients. But we do have a high standard as to what we require for our lab system to be working correctly. And it's not set up it's not like, Dr. Gutierrez decided that no, we try to compare ourselves to what's going on international guidelines. It's what's very similar to what Lucy's been telling us. So we have around a 60% blastulation rate, but 47% blastulation rate on good quality embryos, which are the ones that we will transfer, freeze, or do PGTA on.
Okay. And in the UK, one of the issues that we have is that getting stats for surrogacy cases is quite challenging, in having those success rates, because the information isn't really all reported. Are there stats, or can data be captured and recorded, Doctor, in Mexico City? You're certainly with your clinic for looking what surrogacy rates, success rates look like.
The beauty of surrogacy is that success rate should be high. Why? Because you have a PGTA tested embryo that already gives you a 62% live birth rate, 65% live birth rate, and into a uterus that should be without any pathologist conditions, and a patient that shouldn't have any comorbidities. So pregnancy rate should be high. Unfortunately, in Mexico, and as in most places in the world with surrogacy, which is a little bit complicated to get the data, reporting is not demanded on this kind of cases as to success rates on the IVF cycle. Yeah. We do need to report when the surrogate gets pregnant and do the whole legal process. But whether she was transferred 5 times before, 2 times got pregnant in the first try, there is no clear data on what's going on. Yeah. However, we can compile from going back on the IVF process that the pregnancy rates should be higher than patients that are going through a normal IVF process, because in theory all the components have to be aligned.
Optimum.
Optimum. Exactly. They're optimizing treatment.
Thank you. So one of my final questions that I wanted to ask you, Doctor, in particular, because obviously of the HFEA and some of the regulation that we have in the UK with regards to double embryo transfers. What's the process in Mexico if someone's insisting on or wanting a double embryo transfer? What are the risks, and what would you be advising people?
So to be honest, once again, Michael, there is no clear regulation. So we could be honest and say you could transfer it. There are people who do still triple embryo transfer, and there are justifications on this. Okay, this is Mexico. Sure. We're talking about Mexico, not Fertilidad Integral, because if your lab system is still doing day 3 transfers, you don't have such a great blastulation, you don't know how to freeze yet.
Sure.
There are situations where you do have to individualize clinics and treatment. But at Fertilidad Integral, we recommend always single embryo transfer. Patients are allowed to opt in to double embryo transfer if they've been correctly advised. Okay, so you do have to understand, if you do a double embryo transfer, that there's a good chance that we're looking for a twin pregnancy. Okay, and the twin pregnancies have higher complexities during pregnancy. So C-section is very high. Yeah. There's a very high risk of low birth weight, premature delivery, higher risk of preeclampsia, higher risk of maternal death. So patients have to understand why we recommend doing a single embryo transfer, but if they choose to do a double embryo transfer, they're allowed with the correct medical advice. Okay? We will never do triple embryo transfers. We don't do it. We first of all don't recommend it, and we will not do it in our clinic, because then we're exposing patients into a possible medical complication, and this is, I don't know how you say iatrogenia in English.
I am, Lucy, do you know?
Enough.
Iatrogenia, that's a word in English? Yeah? Well,
That.
okay, that.
As I thought, I'm just in awe of the work that the two of you do. You know, I think this is just great to, not only for me to listen to as someone that kind of has a bit of inside knowledge to what goes on, but I know for our listener and for any of our viewers today, this is going to be something that's going to give great peace of mind. I think the spoiler alert here is it's exactly the same, you know. That's kind of what. So if you've just tuned in, I'm sorry to tell you, but you know the protocols and the treatment and what goes on here in Mexico City versus what goes on at your clinic in Herts and Essex in the UK. The majority of the work is exactly the same to a degree, and the standards are from both camps exceptionally high, and what you'd be used to expecting. So I want to say a massive thank you to both of our guests today, to Dr. Lucy Richardson and Dr. Jose Gutierrez from Fertilidad Integral. Thank you very much. If you've enjoyed this particular episode today, then feel free to head over to our app or our website at mysurrogacyjourney.com. And we would love to get more information over to you. Similarly, you can book a consultation on our website. Just again, head to mysurrogacyjourney.com and head to book a consultation. I've loved having you with me today, presenting solo without my other half. But thank you very much for listening and watching, and we'll be back with you real soon. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you very much.